Hi, good evening. Welcome. I'm Michelle White, Senior Curator at the Menil Collection, and we're so pleased you're here tonight for our artist talk with William T. Williams. First, I'd like to thank the artist for being here. This is his first post-COVID trip, and we are very lucky he is here from New York City. I'd also like to first thank the Cockrell family for making this artist talk series possible. The series was initiated in 2018, and the goal is to offer the public an opportunity to hear directly from artists whose works are in our collection. Up next in the series is a talk by the artist Marcia Curry on Saturday, April 9th at the Menil Drawing Institute. And if you'd like to learn more about so many upcoming programs, please visit our website. Williams's talk this evening is held in conjunction with the presentation of the large-scale 1971 painting Mercer's Stop. It's currently on view outside of our modern and contemporary galleries, and if you haven't had the chance yet to see it, please come back. It will be up for a few months, and it's really important to see this incredible work in person. I'd like to thank so many of you here tonight who have made this work here possible. I'd also like to thank Michael Rosenfeld and Hallie K. Harrisburg for their support. Before we get started, if you could please turn off your cell phones. We're also requesting masks this evening. We are recording tonight's program. Thank you, Ben and his team. And so you will be able to see the recording of tonight on the Menil's YouTube in a few weeks. I want time for some questions for the artist, so save those until the end. Tony will come around with a microphone. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest this evening, artist William T. Williams. Williams was born in 1942 in Cross Creek, North Carolina. He grew up in New York City, and he currently spends his time between the city and Connecticut. He received his MFA from Yale University in 1968. In that year, Williams initiated the renowned Artist in Residency program at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And he also helped to found Smokehouse Associates, a collective of artists who developed community-oriented public art projects in Harlem. In 1971, he began his career as a professor of Brooklyn College. The Menil's connection to the artist begins this year as well. In 1971, Williams was included in two influential exhibitions that year, Some American History, curated by Larry Rivers, and The Deluxe Show, curated by Peter Bradley. Both were sponsored by the Menil Collection and explored ideas of race, abstraction, and the legacy of slavery in the United States. In the past decade, his work has been in many key and critical exhibitions, exploring inclusive narratives of art history, from Soul of a Nation to the recent exhibition at the Contemporary Arts Museum, Houston, the Dirty South. He is the recipient of numerous awards of distinction, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, National Endowment of the Arts Award, the Joan Mitchell Foundation Award. He has been exhibited in solo and group exhibitions around the world and is represented in many major collections, including the Menil. Please join me in welcoming William T. Williams. I just found out, Bill, thank you so much for being here.
Well, it's a pleasure coming back. It's been 52 years, and it's time.
So a lot's changed.
It has changed. This is an extraordinary facility, an extraordinary collection. So I'm kind of honored to be part of it, and certainly to be back in Houston.
So you were here for the opening of Some American History.
I was here for the opening of that exhibition. I think we stayed 4 days in Houston at that point. And it was a beginning of a relationship with the Menils.
And following that, I know you were just telling me about your studio visit with Mrs. de Menil.
She was puzzled by the piece that I did for the Some American History show. And she came to New York, came to the studio, and spent an afternoon with me talking and posing questions and kind of going through my head to figure out what I was about as an artist. And it was a wonderful experience. I mean, if you knew her, there was a quietness about her, and there was a kind of quiet sense of presence as well. A very kind of graceful and really extraordinarily sophisticated lady.
Well, we're here tonight because we have your incredible work from 1971, which is the year of both exhibitions on view. And I have to tell you, it's been so wonderful watching our viewers encounter this work for the first time. And I think for many, it's the first time they've seen your work in person. And I think one of the strongest reactions that people have had is to the work's palette. And it's certainly kind of defines all of your work from this moment, is this kind of vibrancy, but also this incredible discordance as well with how you're approaching color. And I thought we could start our conversation here with really just how you think about your decisions and how you did in the 1970s, kind of coming out of Yale with how you were approaching your palette.
Coming out of Yale, you have the tradition of Albers and teaching color and color theory. And I wasn't really very interested in that. I was interested in dissidence. I was interested in those things that appeared in the real world, how things clashed, how people walking with clothing, passing each other, all of these kinds of experiences of color, a kind of moving color rather than the static nature of how color was being taught in relation to Albers. So I proceeded to pursue that. I wasn't interested in minimalism in terms of the kind of reductive palette and or the reductive kind of sensibility. And it seemed to me that what I wanted to do was overload the senses, a kind of breakdown of the relationship you have with an object and how then you have to kind of navigate the object when all of your expectations are not there. There's no harmony, there's none of that stuff that exists. And introducing, I think, a different way of proceeding in terms of what abstraction is and what it could be.
So when you were at Yale, was Albers still teaching his color course?
Albers was not there. It was taught by a student of his named Richard Lytle. And the color theory class, I had pretty much had that as an undergraduate at Pratt. So it would have been pretty redundant for me to have taken it there. And the teacher that I had as an undergraduate also was an Albers student.
So do you think your work is a reaction to those theories?
I think trying to carve out a place for myself in the art world, it was apparent to me that the minimalist movement gave me no psychic place to exist. And the psychic place as an artist was far more important to me than formally entering that as a dialogue. And by the time I was coming out of graduate school, that was academic pretty much. It was teachable, it was understandable, and you run the risk very much like being a second-generation abstract expressionist. And that was not in the cards for me. That was not my intent as an artist, nor was it what I was going to settle for.
So I think one of the fascinating parts of your biography is when you're at Skowhegan and you meet Lenny Bourcourt for the first time, which seems like a relationship that really impacted your work. And if you don't know Bourcourt, he was an influential paint maker.
Yes, he was.
And for the Menil Collection, especially led by our conservation team, he's an important figure because of his influence on Barnett Newman's work. But when you were at Skowhegan, you won an award, and essentially you had access to this incredible figure that really impacted your work.
Well, I'll tell you a story. When I won the award, they said, well, Mr. Bourcourt is going to give you paint. That's, oh, terrific, And I went to see him. And he said, well, I have this new stuff that I'm doing. I want you might like that better. And it was acrylic paint. He gave me some, and I went and worked with it. About 4 months later, I get a call, and it's Lenny Bakur, and he said, well, why haven't you come back for more paint? And I said, well, Mr. Bakur, I didn't know I was going to get more paint. And anyway, this relationship turned into a 15-year involvement where I would call him and he would say, well, what do you need? And the truck would show up that afternoon with the paint. And that engagement allowed me to really engage in the art world on the level that I wanted to engage in and to work on the scale that I wanted to work on. It was an extraordinary influence, and he was an extraordinary patron during those 15 years.
I mean, do you think that relationship allowed you to experiment more because you had access to kind of this knowledge of new approaches to pigment?
I think it geared me toward process more, and certainly experimentation, and he was very supportive of that as well. And the pigment that I got from him, which was a material called pearlescence, was essential in a later body of work, which I think there's a slide of it, and you'll see a real transition in the surfaces. And there's a transition at that point in terms of what I think about surface and what I think about light, and a way of engaging with minimalism without the reduction of the hand.
So this would be an example, Texas Lady from 1973.
Texas Lady is a transition from more prismatic paintings, wanting to begin to work in a tonal tradition, and yet not really wanting to do that. At that point, I was teaching at Brooklyn College, and most of the painters were representational painters in the tonal tradition. Philip Pearlstein, Leonard Anderson, Joe Grohl. I had all of those persons as an undergraduate, so I had gone through that training with painting the figure, drawing the figure, and that whole tonal tradition. And I knew I didn't want to do that. So consequently, I think what occurred was it's a reaction to that a great deal. But it's also a reaction to, again, trying to find that psychic place within the prevailing kind of thought processes that artists were involved in at that particular time.
And I love this series too, because as we're coming out of 1971, where the palette really does the work of this sort of idea of discordance, in this series, which is the Shimmer series, you're also playing around with the interaction of different kind of handling of surface textures and even the quality of what's kind of creating this shimmer effect.
That's the beginning of the pearlescence. Prior to that, I had been using powdered metallic powders, and they were highly toxic, so I had to find another alternative. And Lenny just said, well, I have this other stuff that you might want to try. And that was the beginning of that relationship with that material. This is one of the very first ones where I'm still using multicolors in terms of using it. And the surface that you see is actually, it's made by the hand. It's a surface that reacts to light a great deal. So as you traverse the painting begins to shift. The way the light hits it becomes really important. If you're in a studio where there's a window, the painting changes drastically during the day. From the morning as the sun shifts from right to left or from north to south. From north to south or from south to west, the painting shifts as well. So it becomes lighter or it becomes darker. And for me, that was a crucial break and advancement in terms of the minimalist tradition, because it related to any number of other kinds of ways of, one, applying the paint, but also in terms of the engagement with light with the surface. Rather than painting light, it's a physical involvement with the light. And that changed a great deal of thinking on my part. So there's a holistic nature to that whole series of paintings, which I might say modestly is, there's no precedent for it in the history of art.
It's been really wonderful to have the work here at the Menil because of the natural light, especially where we have it hanging at the end of the galleries. You get this amazing afternoon raking light that animates different passages in entirely different ways.
It's that's an early version. This painting comes after that version. I think what began to happen was I began to slow down as a painter. Some of the paintings now, one painting was taking 6 or 7 months to do. So there were less of them produced, but there was more engagement with the surface and more engagement with the painting. And it required an enormous amount of stamina, because if the brush slips once, then you have to kind of erase the whole surface and start again. So on one hand, there was this sense of repetition and the sense of you had to be totally engaged in the painting process. So the physicality became very important to me in terms of a content. This idea of repetition, the idea of control repetition became really important.
And I think too, if you can talk more about that idea of physicality, because something I love about your work is how you approach scale. Mm-hmm. And could you approach kind of, especially as we're talking about Mercer's Stop, which is hanging here and on the screen, mm-hmm. how you think about the physicality of your own body and the finished work of art?
Well, the early paintings were that wide, and that was the size of canvas in terms of width. And when I stand up that high, and I decided that was going to be a surface and a scale that I was going to work with over and over. Because one, it gave me scale to my own body. And in having that scale to my own body, I could come back to composition a lot easier, because there was a given that I knew, and I knew that I wanted all the activity to happen within the given. In some of the latter ones, you'll see that the energy of the painting or the formal elements of the paintings never go off the surface. They all have a sense of containment. That containment was a way of putting a metaphor in the paintings that had to do with the experiences that I was having as a painter at that particular moment. It's a way of putting content without narration, without illustrating something that had to do with containment. So there are layers of formal issues and playing with layers of formal issues, and really kind of tongue-in-cheek sometimes with referencing other artists or other kinds of ideas about the history of art.
So what about, of course, within the non-representational approach you're taking to your work, what about the role of memory?
Memory is important. A lot of what I do has to do with the idea of I've had that experience, but the experience is not necessarily a visual experience. It's a interaction with another human being, or a common kind of experience that I and others have had. And I reference that through titles, but the titles have nothing to do with the paintings. They're two different issues. And I do that because I want literature to be separated from the visual world, that I'm involved in the perceptual world, not in the world of words. And if the narrative is necessary for the person to experience the painting, then my job is incomplete. What I want is the viewer to stand in front of the painting or the objects I make and have an experience only between that object and themselves, and that sense of experience. And I think what can occur, and I hope occurs, is the viewer and the object become one and the same. You're not looking at something, you're experiencing something. And when that happens in the painting is when I'm having the most fun, and what I have been after for the last 59 years that I've been painting.
Incredible. And you've also in addition to the kind of idea of memory as a bodily experience, say, there's also like certainly like almost motifs that you've spoken to about in the work pertaining to quilt making.
Quilt making is the beginning of my experiences. I grew up in the rural South, and I grew up in an environment where most of the families, the women made quilts, and the quilts were made to be used as opposed to being an aesthetic object. But within that, one could tell which person did what quilt. There was a kind of distinction in terms of their sewing, whether the thing was really rectilinear, whether it was lopsided. All of those things I always took once I got out of art school and looked at them as the beginning of an aesthetic and something that had had a profound effect upon me. When I discovered Hans Hofmann and looked at Hans Hofmann's paintings and quilts, is almost at the time when I went from being a representational painter to being interested in abstraction. Hofmann was the first painter that had a grip on me in terms of an abstract painter. I was sent to the Coots Gallery to see a show of Hans Hofmann because the instructor that I had was a man named Richard Beauvais. And he said, you know, you're in the class and I noticed that you never look up at the model. You're always just looking at your painting. And I said, well, you know, I'm interested in the paint. And he gave me car fare to go to the Coots Gallery to see a Hans Hofmann show. And that was an extraordinary kind of experience for me because I had never seen another painter with the lushness of paint and the exuberance and the freedom of putting the material on and taking it off. Most of the other abstract expressionists were much more coming out of something as they were abstract rather than non-objective. And Hofmann to me there was a pure kind of non-objectiveness in the paintings that I saw. And that was one of the first influences. And I think it's still, at times I'm still going through rethinking that. My way of dealing with art history is I go right at it. If, like Matisse always was a huge influence, and rather than try to go around a painter, you have to go through the painter. You have to absorb that, I think, you have to absorb that body of experiences and find a way of transforming it. And that's the approach I've always had from the time I started painting figures to abstractions. And there's one other given in my studio, that the work has to change. I'm really impatient in the studio, and I let whatever occurs in the studio lead me. And anything that I've done in the past, whether it's 20 years ago or 50 years ago, is open to me to change it. You know, it can go out on exhibition and come back to the studio, and I'll start working on it again. And that's just the process, the way I work.
Can you talk a little bit, you mentioned Matisse and Hans Hofmann, which I certainly think about the sort of frontality of your work and these sort of planes of color. And with Matisse too, when we're looking at something like Mercer's Stop, something you do so brilliantly is that tension, I don't know the exact words, but the sort of space between the colors. And those sort of strips where you can see the canvas coming through in that intersection of the colors. And I'm wondering how you developed that formal apparatus in your work.
Two things. The reference to the Red Room, Matisse's Red Room, where there's that separation, which allows a freer way of painting. But the messiness for me in representational painting was always when two colors came together. What do you do with that edge? You spend 2 hours trying to clean it up. And I wanted something that wouldn't slow me down. And when I saw the Red Room and saw that space between it, it gave me a vehicle where you could isolate one color and just work on that color to either intensify it and or to do whatever you want with it. But it was, again, an enclosure. This painting, Mercer Stop, is a reference also to Matisse. It's a reference to the dance. If you look at the painting, you have these kind of concentric things that are going around the edges, very much like the dance, where the dancers are holding hands in that circle. So a lot of the paintings are layered with references to other paintings. But at the time I did this, no one saw all of those references because they never asked me. So I never told them. Just if the secret's there, then the secret's within the paintings. But what I like about, say, Mercer Stop is on one hand, there's a complexity of playing with the idea of frontality, playing with the idea of something flat and modern. But there are references that won't allow that to occur. It won't allow it to be three-dimensional or an illusion or a third dimension in terms of illusion. And it won't allow it to be flat. So I'm in a world where, again, it's almost like a painting that can't exist because I'm not really trying to paint space. That was one of the things I had to kind of get rid of in terms of my background and my training of painting still lifes and painting the figure. And there was just this process at this point. This is 1971. I'm out of graduate school at this point, 2.5 years. And I'm really trying to unload a lot of baggage. I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I mean in terms of if I'm to find the psychic place for me in terms of modern art and in terms of painting, I felt that I had to unload a lot of kinds of things.
So now that the Matisse Red Studio secret is out of the bag, it makes me automatically think of Barnett Newman because, of course, our red Barnett Newman painting that's up now is also inspired by Matisse's Red Studio. And that's also sort of naturally someone I've thought about in relationship to your work. And I'm so curious what you think of Newman and your relationship to his work, especially in this moment, 1971.
Well, he's a historical figure for me at that point. I'm 23, and it's a part of a history book. So the body of information that I'm looking at is knowable to me in terms of there are endless essays about it. The other reference at that point that came constantly was Frank Stella. And I always also mention I was very interested in mudcloth. Mudcloth is kind of a traditional African cloth that has stripes between it. It separates the forms. That would be a more informed reference to the paintings rather than Barney Newman or Frank Stella. It was a way that of finding a formal device, finding something that was accessible historically and accessible in terms of heritable, and finding a way of reintroducing that into modern art. I think a lot of what I did during that period is that kind of assessment, because I think the work is sometimes far more conceptual than most of the writing about my work has been about. Those formal and conceptual elements are sometimes not known and lost.
I mean, 1968, you're coming out of grad school. It's such this pivotal moment in art history. Artists are dealing with the legacy of Jackson Pollock. You're in this kind of post-painterly moment, the rise of minimalism. And your work really, I feel like, stands sort of between these categories. And I'm wondering how, now, we're sort of reflecting back on your early career, where do you see your work sort of fitting in that conversation?
I think the work offers a distinct fundamental shift in what abstraction could be. I think in terms of the weight of being an African-American artist and doing abstractions, particularly during that period. It offered an alternative in terms of other reference points, in terms of what was accessible. The hardest part is not that. The hardest part is in terms of making an object that has enough presence that it can withstand what the other kinds of paintings of that moment were. At that moment, you couldn't go into a museum without there being a Warhol on the wall, or a Morris Lewis, or who else would? Olitsky. And again, my thing is, where psychically can I fit in all of this as an artist? Where do I call out a piece of the world and declare myself as a great artist? And I think I did that. I think I've weathered the storm in terms of 52 years of painting. And a lot of the paintings, this painting is 51 years old. And I think it still has a sense of presence that it had 51 years ago. And I'm pretty happy with it. And I'm really happy with its new home.
So speaking of 51 years ago, can you talk to us about your current practice and specifically how your work from the 1970s has sort of shifted and changed and what really kind of continues in how you're approaching your work today? And I'm going to flip towards the end of our slideshow. Is this a good one to stop at?
Well, maybe we can go back to the first slide,
okay.
Because they're in chronology.
Okay, we're going to go back. Sorry, we're going all the way.
Okay. All right. This is one of the first paintings that I did when I got out of graduate school. I was out of graduate school 6 months, and the Museum of Modern Art bought this painting. It's called Elbert Jackson, LAMF, and it's a reference to my grandfather. And it's 10 feet by 10 feet. It kind of, getting back to the idea, if you notice the points all stop at the perimeters, that idea of containment, that idea of, what's the word? Suppression, spatial. I think it's there. The next slide, please. The next slide is one that's called Sweets Crane. And Sweets Crane is a character out of a play by a playwright named Chuck Cadone. And Chuck Cadone's play won the Pulitzer Prize for his play was called No Place to Be Somebody. It was produced by Joe Papp at the Public Theater. And one of my relatives was one of the characters in the play. He was Sweets Crane. And to give you a narrative of who Sweets Crane was, Sweets Crane had gone to prison. He had come out of prison. Prior to that, he owned a bar. And he goes to prison because he gets in a fight, because people are trying to muscle in on the bar. And anyway, he goes to prison, he comes out, and he meets another young entrepreneur that has a bar. And the play evolves around this relationship between this younger person and the person that had had the same experiencing and had given him this advice. So thus, Sweets Crane. The painting was bought by Ford Nelson Rockefeller, which is out of the Whitney Annual in, I guess, 1971, somewhere in there, 1969. A lot of these paintings now are 52 years old. Most of you probably never heard of my name, but I've been painting for a very long time. And I decided to remove myself from the art world completely and just stay in my studio for the next lifetime. And I've kind of stuck to that over a very long period of time. These are large-scale drawings. The drawings are probably 4 feet by, maybe 4 feet by 5 feet, somewhere in there. They're very large. These were drawings or works on paintings on paper that would be done at the same time I was doing the paintings. And they were, sometimes there are 2 or 3 versions of them where I'm trying to work out color things. They precede the shimmering paintings, the absolute monochromatic paintings. Let's try another slide. Again, a very large one. And then it comes to this series. This is called Sweet Pat. Sweet Pat is a reference to my wife of 60 years. And at this point, I'm living in a building, and my neighbor downstairs is Ken Nolan. My neighbor above me is Joe Shapiro. There was an elderly painter in the building named William Copley. And that was the building interaction. Nolan had done a series of target paintings that most of you know. And this was like a tongue-in-cheek reference to it on steroids. And he was somewhat taken back by it, but then began to realize the difference between the two, that it's not, again, a reductive kind of thing that I was involved in. But it's also the very first introduction to the pearlescence, getting even more frantic in terms of overloading. It's called Neck Bones.
Should I keep going?
Yes, please. And Skowhegan 1. Skowhegan 1 was painted in Maine at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. I did a summer residency there. And I was living, the house they gave me was on a lake. And you have this gentle breeze that would come across the lake. And it kind of opened up something in my head because I had grown up in Far Rockaway, right near the beach. And you had this sense of water constantly. And I went to high school in Manhattan, which means Rockaway is at the end of the public transportation. And it was an hour ride back into the city every day but you had to come across Jamaica Bay, and every morning at 6:30, 7 o'clock, I would be on the train coming across Jamaica Bay, and the water would have this gentle ripple, and the sun rise would be coming across it. And then I realized that had had such an enormous impact upon me, that the relationship to the shimmering, to the metallic, and to the pearlescence was a natural for me, because it had been an experience that was suppressed probably. I'm not sure that's the right word, but in the memory bank. And as I worked more and more, it became much more natural in terms of using it. It's the most distinct body of work, which I think, again, introduces a surface that there is no precedent for it in the history of art. The closest thing, I think, is to early Cubist paintings, where there's a chisel quality that goes across the surface. But the chisel quality in those paintings have a weight to it in terms of the paint. There's a physical weight, the way it sits on the surface. In these paintings, what one experiences is the light and the painting. So it's very much in the tradition of painting light, but it's forcing the light to do a job rather than illustrating light.
Okay, we have to know the story of this. We're in Texas. This is Texas Lady from 1973.
This is Texas Lady. Texas Lady is a reference to a lady from Texas. It's a reference to the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. And the lady's name is Nancy Nagley. Everyone said, do you know Nancy Nagley? Well, it was a dedication to her because she bought me a lobster. And it was the first lobster that I ever had. She gave me a birthday party and bought a lobster. And coming from Queens, I had never been to Maine before. I had been to Maine as a student, but I had never had a lobster. And that was just a kind of playful gesture to a Texas lady.
That's amazing. But Bill, can we shift to taking some questions from the audience?
Sure.
I know you must have questions out there, and we're excited to take them. There's Tony in the back, and he's walking around with a microphone so we can hear. There's one in the front here, Allison.
I keep seeing an architectural space in the work. Does that ring true to you, sir?
It does. I was very interested in early Renaissance paintings, where there's kind of an architectural structure around a lot of things. I'm not an architect. I like geometry. I like the absoluteness of drawing and structure. I think there is an underpinning of an architectural way of seeing.
Bill, did you want to talk about this group of work, which comes after the Shimmer series in '73, or is this a part of it?
This is the high point of the Shimmering series, where I drop all of the color and decide to take tonal painting on absolutely head on. And it's one color, which is actually dioxide purple, with this material, and I wanted to see how many tones I could get out of it with just this single color, and how many, there are 18 paintings in the series, and they happen over, I think, a 3-year period. And for me, I had gone so far away from what people were expecting and what they had seen. For me, it was great as an artist. The paintings have a backstory to them because they're about sorrow and loss and other kinds of issues, rather than the exuberance and the celebration of the earlier paintings. But again, it has to do with growing as an artist and beginning to, again, enlarge the palette, enlarge the sense of touch, and speak to, again, this thing which I call modern art in a very, very different way. This is about the time also I'm able to paint more and more. I have the technical support of Lenny Bacour, and I could call him anytime I wanted to and go up to the factory. And either he or one of the people that work there, if I had a technical question, they would figure it out for me. If the material or the Rollex wasn't working properly, they would go through it, tell me what the weight of it is, and tell me what the problems are. So without those kinds of support mechanism, technical support mechanism, in terms of, there was no one that knew more about the material than the person that had invented it and made it. And I was fortunate enough to have that as a support mechanism.
We have a question, Claire?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. What a wonderful talk, and we're delighted to have you here. Thank you so much. There's so much movement in your painting, and you talked about Matisse and the dance and those influences. I'm curious, do you listen to music when you paint? You must.
I do. I listen to music.
And what kind of music?
I listen to jazz primarily.
Well, that's what I didn't know, and I just guessed. I bet he listens to jazz because it just feels that way to me.
Well, the musicians have been huge supporters of the work from the very beginning. And the person who is probably one of the great, how would you describe George Wein? George Wein has been a supporter and a owner and a patron of the paintings, as a number of other jazz musicians have over the years. They've been very, very generous to me. Below me in my studio for 28 years was a musician named Lloyd McNeil, a flute player and composer. And Lloyd would start in the morning at 7:30, and I usually started in my studio about the same time. And we had a ritual. He would play the scales every morning. And he was an accomplished musician, but he did it every morning. And I would tap on the floor to let him know I was there, and he would play a little louder to let me know that he heard me. And this relationship went on for 27 years until he recently passed away. But music has been a really important part of the work. It's a time machine for me in the studio because it allows me to not think about what I'm doing because I become so involved in rhythmic things that are going on within the music. And I think the transition to that is not a one-to-one transition. It's just one of the conditions within the working environment that allows me to work. But I also like to do static things. You know, this is one of the greatest paintings that I ever painted. It's called New Nile, and the reference of New Nile is to my daughter. My daughter's name is Nyla. It took me 7 months to paint it, and
I feel like an image only does it partial justice. To see it in person is fantastic. We have a question here in the second row.
Hi, thank you for your time tonight. This has been really illuminating. I'm wondering if you can take us back to those initial conversations in proposing the residency program at the Studio Museum. And are there artists that you specifically have followed over their careers who have come through that program?
Well, the Studio Museum program, how do I talk about that program? There is, of the contemporary artists that you might know, Terry Jane Marshall came through that program, Julie Matu came through that program, Nari Ward came through the program, David Hammonds came through the program. There's probably not a contemporary artist that you know that hasn't gone through that program, been in residency there. It is the one institution that's had the biggest influence on African American art in terms of either training, support mechanism, allowing them to have a critical dialogue with curators and writers, making all of those things available. It's the infrastructure that was necessary for the development of African American art, given where it was in the late 60s and the attention it was given. So it was crucial from my standpoint that infrastructure had to be built. There had to build a collector support. It's done that. It's built a critical support. And it's now, I think 2 years or 2.5 years from now, their new building will open. That will be an extraordinary institution. I urge all of you to visit it. You will be very surprised at the holdings, the quality of scholarship. The other thing it's provided, it's very difficult to go to any museum across the country and not find a young curator or a writer who hasn't come through the program as well. So it was not only developing artists, it was developing art historians and museum people. Anyway, that's the way it was. Just a simple idea out of graduate school that, you know, if you have an idea and it's not getting the support, do it yourself. You don't need to wait around and do all of that. Just do it. And now, 50 years later, it's a reality. enough said about that.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes.
Over.
Gee, we're going to talk about the drawing.
Sarah?
Thank you. I have a question about Mercer's stop. So the shape at the center, the green triangle shape, has a texture that to me just really pops out from the canvas and kind of almost has a swirl inside. I'm curious about the technique that you used to create this work.
This is one of the early ones prior to pearlescence. It's actually a metallic powder. It's literally a ground bronze powder. I think it's bronze. And it's just a brush. It's just a regular house brush and just a circular motion. And the idea, again, is to impose something on it that's a dissident and force it to be there. Very much like life, things are just juxtaposed. The two bottles are just sitting there. They're not sitting there with purpose, they're just there. And it's just what I like to do in a lot of the works. Just juxtapose stuff. I want to see what it looks like. If it doesn't work, I take it apart and redo it. Except in the shimmering paintings. There's no going back. It has to be right the first time, or the whole thing has to be sanded down and you start again. I was much younger at that point when I was doing those. I was in my mid-20s, and I would love to do some more, but I just don't have the physical strength to do them. Because when I was doing those, I had to work from usually 7 in the morning, probably to 7 at night, really with no stopping to get those surfaces to be like that. And I just don't want to do that anymore. I just don't have the energy, quite frankly.
So, Bill, let's end tonight by talking about 2 drawings in the Menil Collection. And let's talk about them without images, because I almost think it's more appropriate to talk about the idea of these drawings than to actually see images. And these are 2 works in our collection. They were a part of the deluxe show in 1971, acquired by the de Menils. And can you talk about these works and how they conceptually work through time?
I can. These 2 drawings were bought by John de Menil from my first one-man show at Reese Paley. Reese Paley, the shows, there was 2 floors. The paintings were, like Mercer Stop, were on the top level. And on the bottom level, there was just drawings. And John de Menil purchased 2 of them. And I guess they brought them to Houston. And I guess there was a conceptual point to them on my part. They were painted with aniline dyes. Aniline dyes are a fugitive material, and they were composed with an idea that they would disappear. Very much like in almost the character in The Invisible Man, where he paints the room with paint that never dries. There was this kind of playfulness and conceptualness on my part in terms of doing that. I was very aware that the color would disappear, which was a metaphor for what I was going through as a painter in terms of the art world in the latter 60s. If the color disappears, what would be here? Hopefully it would be a human being, a man. Well, over the years, all the color has disappeared from the drawing that is owned by the Menil Collection. So what's left is the structure, underneath structure, that was there, that I had drawn. Now, a second part of this, the underneath structure, was actually printed by the same printer that printed for Picasso and Braque in that generation. So what's left now is this lithograph line in black but all the color has literally faded away. I think the foundation thought that they had done something wrong, but they hadn't done anything wrong. It became a work of art when all of that occurred. It was the second one that had come back in terms of that. I kind of jokingly said to her, laugh when they mentioned it, that all the color was gone. That's what it was supposed to do. That was the idea, that this work of art is not a work of art because of its monetary value. It's a work of art as a conceptual idea. It's a work of art in terms of the experience. And the experience when you find out that something is faded probably was traumatic in terms of shock, but that human response was what was built into the drawing, that it was going to disappear. Very much in the tradition of Rauschenberg erasing a drawing, or Banksy, is that his name? The painting that was $6 million that is destroyed after the hammer went down at Sotheby's or wherever it was. This drawing was done in 1969, and it's 52 years later. We are coming to terms with it. So over the years, there are bodies of work that have all of those kinds of devilish, kind of playful things inside of them. That's always been the keynote of my work, and I guess more and more research is being done, and a lot of those things are now being seen or contextualized.
Yeah, our first conversation was like, I'm so embarrassed, but, and it's been really revelatory to learn about the significance of those drawings. And Bill is working with our team tomorrow to figure out the best approach to photographing those works so we can share them with you and think about how they work, moving forward in history as the color has been disappearing. This is going to be a big conversation tomorrow.
Well, we'll have the photograph of where they started from. You have that
yes.
from the Some American History. No, I'm sorry, the deluxe show. You know where that saturated color started from. And now you have this very subtle, classical, tonal, lovely, non-evasive work. But it's playful.
We're so proud and honored to have it in the collection, both of those works, and to be able to present your painting here. Wow. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for coming tonight. It's been a pleasure to have all of you.
Thank you.